Pleasant good evening to all. So I'm delighted to stand before you and give the introduction to Dr. Julius Garvey. He served as the Chief of Thoracic Surgery at Queen's Hospital Center and is currently an attending surgeon on the staff of the Long Island Jewish Medical Center. He has been internationally schooled and is an associate professor of clinical surgery at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. As a specialist, his specialty is in the diagnosis and treatment of vascular diseases. Dr. Garvey has spoken, taught, presented research results at conferences across the United States and internationally. Dr. Garvey has served on the boards of various organizations, such as the Board of the Education of People of African Ancestry, the Zumbi Foundation, the Brotherhood, the Marcus Garvey Committee International Incorporated, the Read Across Jamaica Foundation, and the African Union African Diaspora Health Initiative. Over the years, he has worked in conjunction with various ministries at the University of the West Indies on issues concerning the education of the Jamaican youth, the transfer of books and medical supplies, as well as a medical student exchange program. He built a school in Jamaica, as well as a school and medical clinic in Senegal. For his work in Senegal, Dr. Garvey was recently named a Goodwill Ambassador for Senegal by President Wade. He has been on medical missions to Jamaica, Haiti, Malawi, South Sudan, and Sierra Leone. He lectures on African history and culture and on the legacy of his father, Marcus Garvey, in the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. As we can see, Dr. Garvey combines a busy surgical practice with his passion for community service. Dr. Garvey is the second son of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the founder and president of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This year makes 100 years since the association was founded in 1914. Two branches of the UNIA were formed in New Providence, and my great-grandfather, Reuben Bethel, was one of the founding members of the Grantstown UNIA branch. Reuben Bethel was present when Marcus Garvey addressed Bahamians at the Southern Recreation Grounds in November 1928. My great-grandfather believed in the vision of your father and the quest to empower the African diaspora. 3 generations of my family have been named Marcus in the honor of your father. My grandfather, Marcus Bethel Sr., my uncle, Marcus Bethel Jr., and my cousin, Marcus Bethel III. Therefore, it is my distinct pleasure to invite Dr. Garvey, an international leader in the effort to achieve justice for the African diaspora.
Such a bright young lady. Please give her a round of applause. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here. And I owe this fact to Philip Smith, who I met in Antigua at a conference. And I told him that I was going to be here in the Bahamas at another conference at this time, which is a Caribbean investment conference which we're having over at Sandals. And it's being put on by Carib News, which is a New York newspaper. So he arranged this and asked me if I would come and speak, and of course, I'm very happy to be here. I called my paper to repair the breach, and I do that because I think that we as a people have had a breach in our continuity, and we have to restore that breach by understanding our story. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me a little bit as we go through a little bit of that story. bring us up to the present. The east and west coast of Africa, as well as southern Africa, began to be invaded in the 15th century, at the time of the second rise of Europe and the defeat of the Moors in Spain. First the Portuguese, then the Spanish, Dutch, English, and other Europeans invaded and either set up trading posts or settled on the continent of Africa. In 1884 to 1885 at the Berlin Conference, the invasion of the interior of Africa was formalized, and all of Africa became a colony of Europe except for Ethiopia. So in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the Americas, cultural penetration and dislocation have taken place extensively in the last 500 years of European imperialism, chattel slavery, colonialism, South African and American apartheid, and general socioeconomic, cultural, and physical domination. In this way, for all intents and purposes, Africa and Africans as an independent voice were silenced after 1885. In 1900, Britain had the largest empire in world history. It controlled a quarter of the world's population and 12 million square miles of the Earth's surface. France was second, controlling much of North Africa and parts of West Africa, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. King Leopold killed 10 million Africans in the Congo from 1885 to 1909. More than 60 million Africans were uprooted from the continent and transshipped to the Americas as slave labor. Spain and Portugal decimated and enslaved Central and South Americans, killing tens of millions. After the American Revolution in 1776, the colonists continued the British policies of genocide and slavery, largely exterminating the native population. To bring about this physical domination of a people and the confiscation of their property, superior weaponry was necessary, and a willingness to use this to slaughter large numbers of human beings, usually with a kill ratio that averaged 500 to 1. In order to justify this barbarism and the selling of humans as commodities for profit, it was first necessary to define them as primitive and inferior. African history, culture, and contributions to civilization were destroyed, distorted, or denied. This proceeded systematically from the 18th century in the universities of Europe, as well as in literature and art. The same Africans whom Herodotus praised so much as the most civilized of men, and who brought civilization to Europe via the Greeks, 1000 BC, and again 700 years ACE via Spain, Portugal, and Italy, were now portrayed as naked savages and cannibals by the fevered imagination of a people bent on world conquest and the exploitation of all resources, human and otherwise. Thus began our dark ages as an African people. The process that began with physical conquest proceeded with cultural invasion, wherein the indigenous culture is invalidated and the oppressor's culture substituted. Manipulation of the existing social structures to further domination. Miseducation, whereby the people learn negative things about themselves and positive things about the oppressor. And finally, as the icing on the vanilla cake, religion was used to complete the process of domination. Islam in northern and eastern Africa and Christianity elsewhere. So by physical violence, psychological dislocation, and spiritual coercion, we have become the pawns of a Euro-American civilization that dominates the world. Western concepts of social democracy, capitalism, socialism, communism, progress, and development have universal preeminency. We are incarcerated by a materialist vision of the world that has the status of secular religion. The capitalist entrepreneur is our savior. The multinational corporation is our employer. Greed is our God. Money our only value. And heaven is where the prophets pile up. This material view is superficial to to the extent that it sees everything as separate and distinct, resources necessary for survival is limited, and the highest human values are given to aggressiveness and acquisition. The end result is an unstable situation of insecurity, anxiety, and fear. Greed becomes a virtue, and competition a necessity. The more one gets, the more one wants. There is never enough to guarantee security and obliterate fear and anxiety. One immediately tries to protect what one has and sets up an in-group and an out-group, some sort of elitism, sexism, classism, racism, capitalism, with a hierarchy and top-down control. Within these systems, one is defined not by any human or divine intrinsic worth, but by one's competitive accomplishment and or material accumulation. We thus have winners and losers in this deadly version of the game of life, the essence of which is individualism and competition and control. This materialist culture has led the West to attempt to colonize the world, steal whole continents, enslave a race of people, perpetrate genocide against other ethnicities, bring the world to the brink of nuclear disaster while depleting the non-renewable resources of the planet and creating deforestation, soil erosion, toxic waste, and pesticide buildup and global warming. This is clearly an expression of a suboptimal system of scientific materialism based on dualistic thinking of self versus other, that separates individuals from each other, humans from our environment, and seeks to replace nature with machines and shopping malls. Marcus Garvey was born into this world in Jamaica in 1887, just 2 years after the Berlin Conference, where European powers divided up the continent of Africa among themselves. The second most dastardly deed in history after the advent of the slave trade and the destruction of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The slave trade ended in the British Caribbean in 1838, in Cuba in 1886, but in Brazil not until 1888. Marcus Garvey spent his whole life as a subject of the British government and died in 1940, just short of his 53rd birthday. During his lifetime, he defined Pan-Africanism and led the largest mass movement of African peoples outside the continent of Africa. The structure of Pan-Africanism as a response to colonialism rests on the shoulders of many giants before Marcus Garvey, in the latter half of the 19th century. Men such as Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, Alexander Crummell, Martin Delaney, Henry Garnett, Edward Wilmot Blyden, and others such as Robert Love. It was in 1900 that the Trinidadian lawyer Henry Sylvester Williams first used the word and organized the first Pan-African conference in London. The organization which Marcus Garvey founded in 1914 in Kingston, Jamaica, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, had at its height in the 1920s a membership variously estimated at between 6 and 11 million, 1,200 divisions in 40 countries, from America to Zambia. The organizational newspaper, The Negro World, was the largest Negro weekly in the United States and was published continuously from 1918 to 1933. It was printed in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French. Even though banned in many colonial territories, it penetrated them all, from Kenya in the east to South Africa and to Senegal in the west. Jomo Kenyatta said, and I quote, "In 1921, Kenyan nationalists unable to read would gather around the reader of Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, and listen to an article 2 or 3 times. Then they would run various ways through the forest, careful to repeat the whole, which they had memorized, to Africans hungry for some doctrine which lifted them from their servile consciousness in which Africans lived." The main principles of his organizational effort were: 1, to unite all African people in a fraternal bond and a common identity, common source, common beliefs, and a common culture. 2, to develop a nation-state in Africa that would lead to the future freedom, independence, of unity of other African states. 3, self-reliance, whereby the paradigm for development was African, not European. It was therefore communal, inclusive, cooperative, and socially just. 4, the economic policy was to regulate the use and flow of capital for the greatest good. There was no free trade, there was no invisible hand, and there was no free market. This was really economic democracy. 5, education. He said, we're going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. He recognized that education began with the spiritual essence of the human being, and this had to be nurtured in order to guide scientific materialism, which on its own was leading to chaos and disaster. But he recognized also that the proper application of science and technology was the only way for Africans to develop industrially. 6 was culture. He saw culture as the milieu in which people developed, and as such could be used as an instrument to change the dependent psychology of the previously enslaved colonized African person. His use of titles, symbols, images, propaganda, and parades are without parallel in the motivation of the African person. His social and political philosophy was a major impetus for the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. He had a similar influence in the Caribbean in the 1930s. His theology predate Black liberation theology, and there is no area of African nationhood that he did not cover in his organizational structure or his philosophical teachings. Psychology, culture, education, religion, government, economics, business, entrepreneurship, trade, investment, character development, etc. He was completely dedicated to the unity and development of African people. He said, we of the UNIA are determined to unify the 400 million Negroes of the world to give expression to their own feelings. We are determined to unite the 400 million Negroes of the world for the purpose of building a civilization of their own. And in the effort, we desire to bring together the 15 million in the USA, the 180 million in Asia, the West Indies, Central and South America, and the 200 million in Africa. We're looking towards political freedom on the continent of Africa, the land of our fathers. He penned a prophetic poem while imprisoned in Atlanta in 1927. It's called Hail United States of Africa. I'll just read a little bit, the first two stanzas. Hail United States of Africa, free. Hail motherland most bright, divinely fair. State in perfect sisterhood united, born of truth, mighty thou shalt ever be. Hail sweet land of our fathers' noble kin. Let joy within thy bounds be ever known. Friend of the wandering poor and helpless thou, like to all, such freedoms reign within. This movement towards freedom, nationhood, independence, and self-reliance created enormous resistance among the colonial powers, and those with ideological differences such as integrationists and communists. He was targeted by J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, the British, French, Belgian, and Dutch colonial powers. In 1920, he held the first International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World in New York City. There were 2,500 delegates from all over Africa and the diaspora. The opening session at Madison Square Garden had a crowd of over 25,000 people that spilled out into the streets. The issues and grievances of the delegates and the people they represented were discussed for the entire month of August, at the end of which they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. It set out in 12 sections the conditions faced by Africans throughout the world, and ended with 54 demands which outlined the broad agenda of Pan-African nationalism. This was a Magna Carta for African people, and in his own words, was the greatest legislative assembly ever brought together by the Negro peoples of the world. He said, we believe in the freedom of Africa for the Negro people of the world, and by the principle of Europe for the Europeans and Asia for the Asiatics, we also demand Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. It predated the United Nations Declaration human rights in 1948. There were further conventions in 1921, 22, 24, and 26, in Kingston, Jamaica in 1929 and 1934, and Toronto, Canada in 1938, each allowing for an exchange of experiences and the development of organizational initiatives about political, economic, and social issues that faced Africans everywhere. Historically, these conventions were the precursors for today's Pan-African Parliament. Kwame Nkrumah said, long before many of us were even conscious of our own degradation, Marcus Garvey fought for African national and racial equality. Again, I quote, I think that of all the literature I studied, the book that did more than any other to fire my enthusiasm was The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, published by his wife. Malcolm X said, every time you see another nation on the African continent become independent, you know that Marcus Garvey is alive. It was Marcus Garvey's philosophy of Pan-Africanism that initiated the entire freedom movement, Rastafari, which brought about the independence of African nations. And had it not been for Marcus Garvey and the foundation laid by him, you would find no independent nations in the Caribbean today. All of the freedom movement that's taking place right here in America today was initiated by the work and teachings of Marcus Garvey. Martin Luther King Jr. said Marcus Garvey was the first man of color in the history of the United States to lead and develop a mass movement. He was the first man on a mass scale and level to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny and make the Negro feel that he was somebody. The Pan-African mantle was passed to Kwame Nkrumah after the 1945 Manchester Conference. He returned to Ghana in 1947 and began his political struggle, which led to the independence of Ghana in 1957. For him, this was but the first step. He said, the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is followed by the total independence of all Africa. His watchword was, Africa must unite. He called the first All-African Peoples Conference in 1958 and began seeking support for his ideas of unity and the continuing anti-colonial effort of liberation for all Africa among the independent countries. He was willing to put the resources of his own country to bring about that goal. He set up training centers and finance liberation movements around Africa. The various heads of state were subject to ideological differences, external manipulation, and the heady wine of newfound nationalism. This quickly divided the players in Africa into two groups, the Monrovia group, which was Ethiopia, Liberia, and Nigeria, and the Casablanca group, which was Egypt, Ghana, and Guinea. Nkrumah and others founded the Organization of African Unity in 1963 as a compromise to the support of immediate unity of all African states. Emperor Haile Selassie was instrumental in arranging the compromise, and the OAU headquarters was placed in Addis Ababa as reward. This organizational compromise effectively, however, enshrined the colonial boundaries established in 1885 and laid the groundwork for the capitulation of individual political free states to succumb to the economic control and manipulation by their former colonial masters and their citizens. In 1963, Kwame Nkrumah wrote, imperialism is still a most powerful force to be reckoned with in Africa. It controls our economies, it operates on a worldwide scale in combinations of many different kinds, economic, political, cultural, educational, and military, and through intelligence and information services. In the context of the new independence mounting in Africa, it has begun and will continue to assume new forms and subtler disguises. It is already making use of the different cultural and economic associations which colonialism has forced between erstwhile European masters and African subjects. It is creating client states which it manipulates from the distance. It will distort and play upon, as it is already doing, the latent fears of burgeoning nations. It will, as it is already doing, fan the fires of sectional interest, of personal greed and ambition, among leaders and contesting aspirants to power. He continues, we in Africa can only meet them effectively by presenting a unified front and a continental purpose. Our freedom stands open to danger just as long as the independent states of Africa remain apart. If we are to remain free, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. If we are to enjoy the benefits of Africa's rich resources, we must unite to plan for a total defense, the full exploitation of our material and human means in the full interest of all our people. To go it alone will limit our horizons, curtail our expectations, and threaten our liberty. In 1966, the CIA engineered a coup while Nkrumah was out of the country. He went into exile in Guinea, where he died in 1972. Lumumba, Mboyo, Leland Kimathi, Sankara, Sekou Toure, Cabral, Steve Biko, Robert Sobukwe, Nelson Mandela, and many others fell or were marginalized, and African progress was derailed. How did this come about? The foundation of modern globalization can be said to have been started at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1944, towards the end of the Second Great War. That's when the free world's economists and leaders gathered to design a global monetary system to be managed by an international body, ensuring a free market economy for the world. As in 1884, the masters of the universe gathered. This time it wasn't just to divide Africa, it was to dominate and control the world. All countries were to accept the same economic and financial rules and mechanisms for growth and prosperity. Indeed, a new world order. In reality, it was a power struggle between America as a rising world power and Britain and Europe, weakened by two disastrous wars. In consideration for aid, the Bank of British had to cede imperial preference in international commerce, reduce tariffs and trade barriers, and open access to the markets of its colonies. The US dollar reigned supreme. The Marshall Plan soon followed to assist European recovery, but with many of the conditionalities that were later applied to African and Latin American countries even more vigorously. New institutions were soon formed, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to coerce countries to give up their own economic strategies of self-sufficiency and local production, and allow global banks and corporations to take over their economies, thus cementing a tectonic shift in the geopolitical status of the United States, which had now become the superpower. 40 years later, the World Trade Organization was formed to guarantee free trade and movement of goods without tariffs. This was buttressed by other mechanisms such as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and an intellectual property rights venue. Together, these advanced a formula for the globalization of a type of capitalism free from regulation, with free movement of goods and capital, however, not with free movement of labor, and with unfettered free markets. Robert McNamara became head of the World Bank in 1968 and stayed until 1981. He cracked the whip across the global plantation. He threatened non-conforming countries with boycotts and exclusion from the global trading system. Poor countries were forced to open themselves to predator banks and corporations before they could get loans with built-in severe austerity agreements and structural adjustment commitments. Self-sufficiency was the enemy of globalization, so some resistant countries were bought off with huge infrastructure loans. With reduction of expenditures on health and education, prevention or reduction of manufacturing, governments depended on export of manufacturing products, raw materials, and minerals, whose prices were set and manipulated in London, New York, Chicago, Paris, and Brussels. Ghana's coca and Jamaica's bauxite are examples of such manipulation to maintain dependence. This system of globalization or predator capitalism has brought about the greatest inequality between rich and poor countries and people in history, and has undermined sovereignty democratic governments, and national cultures. The end game is debt slavery and the neoliberal consensus of Washington, London, and Paris. The new plantation, which is actually modern feudalism with masters and serfs. So a system designed to increase individual and corporate wealth endlessly by endlessly transforming non-renewable resources into commodities and sold to the world as the answer to poverty and a panacea for all problems, has been seen to benefit only the world's largest corporations and their global bureaucracies. This has brought us to a point where the economic system and society dependent on it has expanded beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. We're running out of resources to feed the industrial economy. Oil, gas, fresh water, clean air, food, forests, biodiversity, species diversity, genetic diversity, wild fish stocks, coral reefs, crucial elements and minerals, ocean space for our plastic trash, chemical pollution, acidification of the ocean, climate change, drought, and global warming. A global crash is fast approaching. African leaders, after 40 years of stagnation, economic dependence, social erosion, and futility, inaugurated the African Union in Durban in 2002 to replace the OAU as the continent's paramount Pan-African institution. The AU has a broader mandate and is oriented towards the regional economic communities and bringing about integration, cooperation, peace, security, good governance, and economic development. There has been a renewed sense of Pan-Africanism pushed by the late Muammar Gaddafi and Abdoulaye Wade, but subscribed to by Thabo Mbeki, Olusegun Obasanjo, Alpha Conakry, Abdel Aziz Bouteflika, Joaquim Chissano, and Meles Zenawi. This led to the 2007 Accra Declaration to accelerate the economic and political integration of the African continent with the ultimate objective of creating the United States of Africa. Of course, this was Marcus Garvey's dream from 1927. An unprecedented act of the AU was the adoption in July 2003 of the AU Constitutive Act as a part of the protocol of the amendment to the Constitutive Act of the AU, which invites and encourages the full participation of the African diaspora as an important part of our continent in the building of the African Union, thereby declaring the African diaspora the sixth region. In addition, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, ECOSOC, Status Article 5, has designated 20 members from the diaspora to occupy seats within ECOSOC. The first ever Global African Diaspora Summit to further this relationship was held in Sandton, South Africa on Africa Day, May the 25th, 2012. I was privileged to attend, as well as members of various diaspora organizations and the heads of states and representatives of the 54 states of the Union, the representatives of CARICOM, and members of South and Central America. I also attended and gave an address to the Pan-African Parliament and the Global African Diaspora Parliamentarians' first meeting on the 23rd and 24th of May at Midrand. Briefly, the joint statement to the heads of states and governments emphasized the need of the parliamentarians to work together, share experiences, and develop policies to enable all peoples of African descent to participate in the development of Africa and to establish an annual parliamentary meeting as a forum to discuss issues relative to our joint goals. Many things were discussed at the Global African Diaspora Summit. The technical experts who were involved, among other things, recommended that the AU should revive and strengthen the OAU initiative on reparations as contained in the Abuja Declaration that was championed by the group of eminent persons, that the AU should campaign for the implementation of all reparations resolutions contained in the UN Durban Declaration and Program of Action of 2001. The declaration of the summit included 10 points and 5 legacy projects for implementation and follow-up. I'll just mention in summary points 6, 7, and 8 to establish Multiple stakeholder working groups comprising the AU, CARICOM, and representatives from the diaspora in the areas of economic cooperation, science, and technology. To set up a diaspora commission to support closer collaboration between the AU and the diaspora community. To set up a diaspora advisory board which will address overarching issues of concern to Africa and its diaspora, such as reparations and the right to return, amongst others. As we look around at the condition of Africa and African people in this centennial year of the founding by Marcus Garvey of the UNIA, ACL, we see a renewed scramble for Africa. The militarization of Africa by France and the United States of America, with Africa protecting their own interest and Africa being recolonized, as Kwame Nkrumah feared. We also see Africans as the poorest people on earth. In America, the wealth of the average African American is 1/20th of his or her white counterpart. It almost seems as if nothing has changed for the last 100 years. So we speak of repairing the breach, which in my view is the full meaning of reparation. If we go to the Oxford Dictionary, we see that to repair is a verb, which means to restore to good condition after damage. Reparation is the past participle of reparare, to repair, and is the process of restoring, repairing, or keeping in repair. Once we add an S, and it becomes reparations, the meaning is slightly altered. The meaning is the act of making amends for a wrong or injury. I would like to suggest that the struggle for reparations is and should be firmly embedded in the struggle for us to repair the damage caused by 500 years of Euro-American dominance, so that we address the root causes of the problem. If reparations is pursued on its own as a moral and legal issue, it will be obfuscated, resisted by the immorality and legal injustices of 500 years of thoughts and actions that are embedded deep in the psyche, attitudes, laws, and activities of those who have created the current conditions. Pan-Africanism is the continued legacy of that struggle to repair and the vision of what Marcus Garvey called the redemption of Africa, and we now call the African Renaissance. The African Renaissance is rooted in the historical fact of Africa being the cradle of mankind and the birthplace of human civilization. It is an alternative project to the current hegemony of European American industrial civilization and its social, political, and cultural dysfunction. It is a global project for the rebirth of Africa as a geopolitical entity, autonomous in decision-making in areas of the economy, politics, culture, social policy, and utilizing science and technology and available resources for the sustainable development of Africans at home and abroad. This can only be accomplished through a United States of Africa. The development paradigm for us cannot be a carbon copy of the system that gave us feudalism, imperialism, colonialism, and now globalization, aka economic feudalism. This is just completing the circle. We go from feudalism and now we're back to feudalism after 500 plus years. We must base the new paradigm on the age-old principles of African humanism, extant in Africa from the oldest civilizations as Ma'at, Ubuntu, and Ujamaa, practiced in various African societies and championed by Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, and others. Our warriors have freed us from our physical chains, but our intellectuals have not freed us from our spiritual, psychological, economic, and cultural chains. We now have the ability to constitute ourselves as the sixth region of Africa, an unprecedented opportunity. I must say that we also have the opportunity here in the Caribbean to pull together as a Caribbean nation, because I do believe that we have a Caribbean identity with a Caribbean culture, and we have a Caribbean civilization. We're a Caribbean people, and we can identify each other wherever we go, whether we're in the Bahamas or we're in the south in Suriname. It's the same Caribbean people. It's a large number of islands, but we're only separated by water. We're not separated by culture. We're not separated by history. And we're not separated by our love for each other. We have to unite politically and become federated states. This is the only way we can resist the changes that are coming down and the debt slavery that we're already in. And we're also feeling more and more the blowback from the recession that has gone through America and Europe and is going back through it again. Marcus Garvey said we must liberate our minds from mental slavery. He also said the current civilization cannot last because it has no spiritual foundation. He further said that it is only through our spirituality and science that we can combat the naked materialism of the current age. He gave us the specific charge when he said, if Africa is to be redeemed, the Western Negro, which is us, will have to make a valuable contribution along technical and scientific lines. Let us then continue the Pan-African legacy, which is our duty, and build on the foundation of our ancestors' principles of ontology and epistemology that guided their praxis and ethos in developing civilizations that made human beings better and not join the industrial civilization that makes better things, but is destructive of both humanity and the environment. We have the technology that will unite us as a region. I just took part in one such teleforum. We have video conferencing, we have Skype, we're as close as we want to be with modern technology such as Facebook and Twitter. We need a legal structure prepared by our politicians and lawyers. We need a think tank that can prepare policies and proposals to be debated in these teleforums and at decision-making conferences. And we need to bring together all our elected officials with the Pan-African Parliament to begin a dialogue at that level. It is up to each of us, the organizations and the governments to which we belong, to bring about the personal and institutional transformations necessary to move us towards our goal of economic freedom, true democracy, peace, prosperity, and happiness. We're 1 billion people strong in possession of the richest continent on earth. There is no reason why we cannot make the 21st century the century of African Renaissance and accomplishment. Let us lead the way for a better future for all humanity. As Marcus Garvey would say, up you mighty people, you can accomplish what you will. Thank you.
Getting late and all that, but Dr. Garvey has agreed that he will, answer a couple of questions if there are any out there. I know I see a mic there. Is there one on the other side of the room as well? Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. Now, you're dealing with the blind lady here, so, somebody else better tell me somebody's on the mic. I got somebody there already? A couple questions? Oh, I was supposed to do this a little earlier. I trust it's not too late. Mr. Anton Hicks, please remove your vehicle. You are blocking an entrance. I should have read that a long time. Okay, any questions? Okay, somebody over here to my right. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening everyone. Give thanks for one and all. I'd like to welcome Dr. Garvey again. Dr. Garvey, I appreciate everything you said and has done. Your father was very inspirational in my life. One of the challenges I find moving through with the Rasta is true spirituality. It's one of my biggest challenges. Let me just know one of my biggest challenges. We spoke of uniting on front, more or less. Do you think we will succeed as a people, with the challenge we have with the spiritual? Do you think we will succeed in developing the necessary things we need to develop to move as a people, in and around the type of spirituality that we are engaged in today? In other words, the churches, the religion that we was taught for the 500 years. Do you think we will accomplish anything? Do you think, and do you think it might be best that we look to develop our own spiritual foundation and move from there first before we can attempt to do anything else? Do you think that is something that we might need to do?
Okay, that's actually a very brilliant question. And of course, we will triumph. We're the first people on earth. So if you believe in a God out there, or whatever, he must have chosen us to make us in his image. So we're God's chosen people. So we were not put on earth to disappear. The one thing that they could not destroy in the transatlantic passage was our spirit. They could damage our mind, they could kill us, they could rape us, they could lynch us, but they actually could not destroy our spirit. One of the problems that we have is a multiplicity of religions, because we were forced to give up our original religions, which were more spiritually based and not based on an individual who came at some point in time, but based on the original spirit in whose image we were made, and that permeates us all the time and is everywhere. There is no God but God. God is here, God is here, God is there. That's our original spirituality. Because you are, I am. Because I am, we are. That goes back to the beginning of time. But religion has come about. In Egypt, there was no word for religion. That's our original and one of our oldest civilizations. There was no word for religion. It did not exist. Life was spiritual, and life was an expression of your spirit. Now, Semitic people who were chased out of Egypt interpreted the spirituality in a particular way and called it their religion. And you'll find that others who believe in the actual physical reality of Jesus Christ, although there is not one iota of physical evidence or historical evidence for a historical Jesus. It does not exist, just as nobody has been able to find 10 commandments anywhere. Nobody has been able to find this covenant wherein God was placed, or God came to dwell, and all God could dwell in a covenant. Anyway, but nobody has been able to find those things. So they are, I hate to use the word myth, because myth in an African sense is a story that carries a truth. But these things are myths that have no basis in fact and actually mislead. And that's a major part of the problem that we had. We were only able to express our spirituality through these modalities, because that's all we were allowed. Now some of us, kept to our African spirituality in Brazil, in Haiti, and Jamaica, some other places. But a lot of us lost that and became indoctrinated by these so-called major religions. And, if you look at the history of these so-called major religions, they've always caused wars and continue to cause wars. They're not religions of love and peace. You see, and our spirituality is about love and peace. Because my spirituality is the same as yours. I identify that in you, and I respect that in you, and I dignify that in you. So when I'm being spiritual in that sense, I will not hurt you, because I see you as a brother and a sister, and so on and so forth. So yes, we have to go through, retrace those steps, go back through that misunderstanding to get to our spirituality. Marcus Garvey did that for us. He says, take down those white images and so on. He says, we know that God is a spirit and exists all the time in all of us, everywhere. But everybody worships God through their own spectacles. So we must worship God through the spectacles of Ethiopia. So picture of a divinity on the wall, we have to make it a black man, a black person. And he said the same thing about Jesus Christ. He said, if you look at the essentials of Christianity, the greatest aspect of it is the teaching of love. And if Jesus Christ wasn't born, then that would have to be reinvented, a religion of love. And on the other hand, he said, if you follow the genealogy of the Bible, you can trace it back through Jesse. And you could see that Jesus then, if he was real, following this genealogy, then he was a black man. He had the blood of all people in his veins. So, he has shown us a way to get away from a white God and a white Jesus and a white religion, and to get to a true religion, which is a religion of the Spirit, which you can have symbols, because that makes it easier for people to understand. But you have to understand exactly what the symbols mean, so that you're really pointing to the right thing and to the truth. And as you know, we're spiritual people. Anywhere we are, we have the largest number of churches or whatever it is. And that's definitely injuring us. And whether it's churches or mosques or whatever. I'm not necessarily attacking any religion, because every religion tries to find truth in its own way. But what I'm trying to tell you right now is that all religions came out of Africa. And were an attempt to understand the original African understanding of spirituality and man's relationship to divinity. Everything came out of that. And then it came back to Africa now in an altered sense. You see, based on somebody else's experience, somebody's culture over time. And that was now being presented as some kind of permanent truth. It's not a permanent truth, it's just a cultural expression of those people. So you're perfectly right, we have to get rid of that.
My question is in regards to, well, first of all, thank you for your knowledge teaching this topic. I think it's very important in this kind of society where there's the masses hearing another message.
I'm sorry, put the microphone a little closer to you.
Where there's the masses hearing a different message, and then for for this to come forward, because I feel like in pockets around the world, but here in the Bahamas as well, people are understanding that. But I think it's important for people like you to continue to rehash that message. My question is in regards to globalization and spirituality. You talked a lot about spirituality, but in my mind, I feel like globalization is almost like the villain or the antagonist almost for spirituality. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, absolutely. Globalization is global capitalism. I mean, it's not globalization, as a word. It's global capitalization. And it's global corporatism. And it's the running of the world by major corporations who are located in New York or in London or in Paris or Brussels or whatever it is. Okay? You see, these are the people that are running the world. It's what you might call the G7. You see, it's the people on the Security Council of the United Nations who make all the rules and can veto everything and so on and so forth. That's what globalization is. And globalization is the enemy of self-sufficiency. You see, it is carried out by, as I mentioned in my talk, the World Trade Organization, et cetera, who make these laws that many of our presidents and heads of nations, finance ministers, etc., did not understand or were coerced into adopting. You see, where they could no longer produce locally. They had to buy goods from abroad and reduce any kind of a tariff and have free trade. So you have Coca-Cola. Let's say Grace was making whatever it is in Jamaica or in the Bahamas or whatever it is. Coca-Cola can come in and flood the market with Coca-Cola at whatever reduced price. You see, because they're a global organization and they can wipe out your local industry in no time, because how can you stand up to that? So you find all the small and medium-sized businesses have gone. You see, and they're replaced by these global corporations. And again, the end result of that is maximum corporate wealth, and you're destroying the entrepreneurship of the average guy in the street who would have the small and medium-sized business. So I have nothing against capital or a form of capitalism that uses capital productively. But what you have, for example, now in the United States is that productivity of the worker has increased like this. His salary has stayed like this. So the corporate entity, its profits are up here. He doesn't pass any of it on to the worker. Plus the fact his profits are now overseas. Maybe the Cayman Islands, not too far away, and different places in Switzerland and so on and so forth. So it's not being recycled. It's a system that cannot maintain itself. That's why it's going to crash again, because it crashes periodically because of its inequity. So we can't buy into that system. We have to create something that's self-sustainable, that's self-sufficient. We have to manufacture for ourselves. We have to be able to feed ourselves. We have to be able to clothe ourselves. We have to be able to house ourselves. We have to be able to make toilet paper, for Christ's sake. We have to be able to make soap. You know what I mean? Why should we import those things? We can do those things. We may not end up making, Caterpillar tractors or airplanes, but we can do all those other things for ourselves. And if we need a Caterpillar tractor, then we can buy that from, the manufacturer in Ohio or wherever Caterpillar tractors are made. But we must get back to self-sufficiency. And to get back to that, it's a fight. That's why I say we have to unite. Because only in unity with ourselves here, CARICOM, with the African Union, with Central America, with Latin America, with Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, all of those places, we have to unite and create this other paradigm. We have to deal south-south, not north-south anymore. Because all they want to do is dominate us. And they want that to go on in perpetuity.
Final question, I think.
Look for me in the whirlwind, look for me in the storm, look for me all around you. I shall come back with countless millions of blackened you to fight for freedom, liberty, and life, said the prophet. Dr. Julius Garvey, welcome to the Bahamas. one brief question. You said earlier, you mentioned reparations, that you cannot only look at that singly. I want to know if you had a view on repatriation, being the Rastafari movement, see reparation and repatriation, that's how, like right on, left on. Do you have a view about repatriation?
Okay, thanks very much, for that statement. Sorry, and I'd like to thank Rastafari for being one of the co-sponsors of this event. And Rastafari have gone through the same sort of trials and tribulations that Marcus Garvey has gone through, because you all have been vilified by different segments of proper society, etc., over the years, and we know all about that. The beautiful thing about you is that you have recognized the evil nature of Babylon, and that you cannot exist and sing your song in that strange land, and therefore you have to create your own environment. And in doing that, you have to return to self, and you have returned to self spiritually, and you have returned to nature, because that is your origin. So I want to big you up for being true to your African self. Yeah, you're definitely the seed out of which a lot will grow, because people admire you for your persistence and your courage. People may have some differences in ideology, but we all don't have to think exactly alike to want the same goals. And certainly repatriation is valid. It's on the books, and there are many African countries that will repatriate diaspora Africans at the present time. I know that in Ghana there was a program, as you know, obviously in Ethiopia there was such a program, and it's in existence at Sashimene. And this needs to be dealt with by us as we come together and form the sixth region. This is one of the things that we have to do. And it's not just a matter of repatriation in the sense of going back there looking for some kind of handout or a piece of land or whatever it is, but it's also to bring our talents and contribute to the development of Africa. As I quoted there, Marcus Garvey said that the reconstruction of Africa, that the Western Negro, meaning Africans in the diaspora, will be making a significant contribution to the African Renaissance. And if you look at where Pan-Africanism has gone in the first half of the 20th century, we handed the torch. It was all about the diaspora Africans who created the concepts of Pan-Africanism. We handed it over to the Africans, such as Jomo Kenyatta, such as Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and so on. And then they ran with it. And I think we now have to create a similar paradigm that will replace the paradigm of industrial capitalism and scientific materialism, because it does not contain the spirituality that is necessary for us as human beings, because we're primarily spiritual people. We're not robots, Scientific materialism is trying to replace us with robots. It's ludicrous. What is the point of life if you think, there's such hubris and such arrogance and such ignorance and such stupidity that want to replace human beings with robots. I mean, it took 16 billion years. Even their science tells them and us that it took 16 billion years to create us, the most intelligent, wonderful, divine creature in existence. How can you create a robot to replace us? A robot is a machine. The young lady before was talking about epigenetics. You see, epigenetics is our spiritual self. You see, and if our spiritual self is damaged to the extent what the seeds are implanted in our memory and in our subconscious, then that will act on the DNA and the genetic structure. But if you free your mind, and you get back to the pure, original, primordial spirit, then that will turn on the appropriate genes. So my brothers and sisters, free your mind.